Hey everybody, it's Steve Presser, your Director of Adult Discipleship here at Mount Zion, and this is week number 2 in our Lent study of Perspectives of the Passion. And this week we're looking at one of those most famous characters surrounding the Passion story, and it's that of Pontius Pilate. So if you're familiar with the story, Pontius Pilate, he was the Roman prefect. He was almost like the governor, if you will, supporting the Romans over the top of the Jews there in Judea. And it was Pontius Pilate who ultimately had the final say in what to do with Jesus. And what we want to look at today when we talk about the perspectives of the Passion, the perspective of, is there something in Pilate that we also find ourselves wrestling with, whether it's in our life of faith or maybe just life in general, that still has spiritual implications in how we live our life. But it's this, is that what we're going to see in Pontius Pilate is the self-conscious versus the self-serving, right? So it's the life of integrity and truth and purpose against that sense of pride or the ego or the fear, all those untruth things that wage a war within us. And so for Pontius Pilate, it's the self-conscious versus the self-serving. Ultimately, we're going to be looking at what is the internal war raging inside us. So when we think about Pontius Pilate, I think we can summarize him quickly to say that he was kind of a weak, people-pleasing figure who condemned an innocent man in Jesus to death despite recognizing his innocence. And we're going to see that in a couple of the places we're going to look at. He recognized his innocence, and it highlights the themes of personal responsibility, the power of a crowd and what that can do to influence decisions, but also the consequences of choosing expediency over justice. No matter what Pilate chose to do, there was going to be a consequence. And you can think about that in your own life. Maybe you have a difficult decision ahead of you, or you can think back to when you had to make a decision. And either way, there may have been a consequence. Maybe both situations were horrible consequences, or at least very unpleasant consequences. And we're going to see just how that plays into the decision-making of Pilate. And so that's the question for you. And maybe another way to look at it is this. Have you ever been in a situation where you found yourself to be a bystander? Perhaps there's a reason to step in, and yet you resisted not to. It's an interesting study that I found that said that 62% of people have what's called the bystander effect. In other words, they could be presented with a situation that they could step into, but more often than not, they're just going to sit back and not do anything. And so you also may have heard this phrase, that the triumph of evil occurs when good men do nothing. And we kind of see that with Pilate as well, and we're going to see that as the story unfolds. So one of the perspectives of the Passion is the willful and passive position of Pilate. He wrestles greatly with his own self-conscious mind while also wrestling with his people-pleasing attitude to the Jews to keep the peace, which then testifies to his own self-serving needs, right? He doesn't want to have his position upended, and that would have happened had he caused an uproar or a ruckus. So he's fighting what looks to be an internal war, and I bet we've all done the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 6 different points to be made when we look at the totality of Pilate. So we're going to bounce around a little bit in the scriptures. And the first point that I want to make to you is that the perspective of Pilate is he was susceptible to following the crowd. So if you have a Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 23 and look at verse 18 through 25. It reads, "But they all cried out together, 'Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, a man who was thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and also for murder.' Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' And a third time he said to them, 'Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving of death. I will therefore punish and release him.' But they were urgent, demanding loud cries that he should be crucified. and their voices prevailed. That's important. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who was thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they'd asked, but he delivered Jesus over, catch this, to their will. And so the demand and the intensity of a crowd was so overwhelming that even after Pilate said for 3 different times that Jesus was innocent, he stated the truth, and yet he couldn't stand on the truth because the pressure of the crowd was so intense. And I think for Pilate, he recognized in that moment that if he did not give in to the demands of the crowd, they then were going to go back and make his life all the more miserable with the Romans. And it would have caused a stir in the city, and it could have potentially had problems. And so there is a great danger of prioritizing public opinion over personal convictions. The second thing is that he ignored the convictions. So remember, he said on 3 separate occasions, why? What has he done? I find no fault. All those sorts of things. And so the internal conflict and the gravity of the decision is something to pay attention to. There are consequences to every decision that we make in life. Sometimes those consequences are pleasant blessings. Sometimes those consequences are just the nature of the beast, if you will. And sometimes those consequences, as in Pilate's case, he was really kind of in what he felt was a lose-lose situation. On the one hand, if he sets Jesus free, he's going to anger the mob. He's going to further anger the mob, and he could have a whole different issue on his hand. If, however, he gave in to the mob, he has to live with himself that he's condemning an innocent man. And we're going to look more at that here in just a minute. So sometimes we make matters worse by the decisions that we make simply because we're trying to avoid harsh consequences. And so you have to ask yourself, are you looking to live with what you think is lesser consequences, or are you looking to live a life of integrity? And yes, life could be more painful for you, but at least you'll be able to look back and live with yourself and the decisions that you make. In the end, I think that for Pilate, when you know, you know. But for him, he let it go anyway. He didn't have the fight in him to keep fighting for truth and to uphold it. It was easier in his mind to let it slip away and no longer have to deal with it. The third point that I'll make to you, if you have your Bible, you can turn to the book of Matthew. Go to Matthew chapter 27. This one has always been an interesting fact for me in that during this trial of Jesus, Pilate's wife comes to him. So Matthew chapter 27, looking at verse 15, it says, "Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted. And they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas, who we talked about earlier. So when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, 'Who do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?'" So this is now another plea on the part of Pilate to try and set Jesus free. We just read previously about the 3 he's innocent kind of statements. Now he's saying, well, maybe there's another way I can get Jesus out of this. For he knew that it was out of envy that they had delivered him up. Speaking of Jesus. Now here's the interesting point. Besides, while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife, this is Pilate's wife, his wife sent word to him, quote, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." Now, isn't it interesting that in this instance, what we see is that Pilate turned a deaf ear to wisdom. Listen to the ones who are there to support you. She sent word to him to say, there is something amiss here and have nothing to do with this righteous man. She called it for what it was, and she's trying to speak into Pilate's decision-making. Imagine that. You're the governor, and your wife is telling you, she probably stayed out of a lot of his affairs so as not to meddle and those kind of things. But on this instance, she had to speak her mind, and she had to tell him the truth and what's bothering and burdening her. And what was bothering and burdening her was that this was a righteous man. And she's pleading with him do the right thing here, have nothing to do. And so we do this sometimes too, is we'll look out to a friend, or we'll go to a pastor for counsel, or we'll seek out some truth, or maybe someone else will just come to you in confidence and say, look, brother, I love you. Sister, I love you. You're about to make a misstep here, and here's what I'm seeing. Here's the truth. And sometimes we will hear it and we'll receive it, but what do we do to act on it? And what we see from Pilate is that he seemingly ignored it. And so I would just challenge you with that is consider when you hear wisdom and you think to yourself, you're right, but, and we start to justify, which then leads to excusing the truth of the wisdom that we have received. So he turned a deaf ear to wisdom, and the next thing that we're going to see is he was blind to the truth. And to see this one a little more clearly, I want you to turn to John chapter 18. So John chapter 18, we're still talking about ongoing discussions that Pilate's having with Jesus. And so in John chapter 18, looking at verse 33, it reads this. This is the banter that Jesus is having with Pilate now. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus to him. Are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? Pilate answered, am I a Jew? Your own nation and chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? And Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not of this world. Then Pilate said to him, so you are a king? And Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world. Now Jesus is about to just lay a truth bomb on him. For this purpose I've come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is on the side of truth listens to my voice. Okay, so what are you going to do with that? And then Pilate said to him, what is truth? He was blind to the truth, Pilate was. The truth is not something. The truth is in the person of Jesus Christ, who is standing face to face with him. And we find ourselves in that very same situation, that the truth that we need to encounter, or the truth that we need to face, is right before us. And yet somehow we can be blind to it, because in this relative world, we often want to think to ourselves, well, what else is true? Sometimes we don't like being confined into one box, or feeling like we're squeezed. We want more freedom sometimes, or we want more options on the table. Again, kind of going back to the consequences thing. But for Pilate, he's hearing from Jesus that anyone who's seeking and testifies to the truth, well, what is truth? And Jesus standing right there, it's like, well, the truth is me. And Pilate's going to have a hard time with that, because he himself has decisions to make. And so we have to ask ourselves that question too. Like, are we blind to the truth that is standing right in front of us? One of the other things that eventually happens then is Pilate loses touch. So if you go back to Matthew chapter 27, Pilate's going to lose touch here, and he does something that is just infamously famous. So in Matthew chapter 27, looking at verse 24, this is what Pilate does. So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning. So remember, he's asked 3 times, what has this man really done? He's proclaimed Jesus' own innocence. He tried to release Jesus instead of Barabbas. Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning. He took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. What Pilate is trying to do here is he's making an attempt to avoid all personal accountability for his actions. truthfully, he is the only one who can sentence Jesus to the cross. And he knows in his heart that it's the wrong thing to do. He knows Jesus was a righteous man. He's battling the voices of his wife. He's battling the voices of his conscience. It seems to be like there's some soul in Pontius Pilate. And yet he also has to fight against, well, what's going to happen of my position, of my power? How am I going to keep the Romans off of me and handling all of these Jews with this brewing riot that would eventually come if he didn't make this decision? And so ultimately, he has this gesture in front of all the people to wash his hands of the situation. And I would venture to guess that for you and for me and many others, we would very much like to face many of life's decisions, maybe even many of our own faith's decisions, and find a way to wash our hands of personal responsibility. And so maybe that's a perspective that you have and that you can resonate with, is that you just want to wash your hands of this thing. You just want it to go away. And as much as you'd like to believe that you can do that, the truth of the matter is you can't, because ultimately you're still in the situation. The final thing we see here with Pontius Pilate is that he finally hits a wall. So if we go back to John chapter 19, let's take a look at verses 18 to 22. So it says, "There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross." Now this is really interesting that Pilate would choose to do this. Remember, he's trying to wash his hands of it. He's got a guilty conscience. He wrote an inscription, put it on the cross, and it read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Now, that's a really interesting phrase, because look at what Pontius Pilate's role was. He was the governor of Judea. He himself is kind of the king of the Jews in a way. So was Herod, who was there. But many of the Jews read the inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Aramaic and in Latin and in Greek. So he did it in 3 separate languages to make sure everyone could read it. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said, 'I am the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." And so you almost get this sense that Pilate's still trying to stand his own ground in his belief and convictions that Jesus is innocent, while at the same time he's trying to wash his hands of the situation, while at the same time he's trying to appease the crowd. And so Pilate finds himself just slipping further and further into quicksand, and there is not a single decision he can make where he doesn't feel trapped, where he doesn't feel like he's going to lose. And what's really interesting about all of this is that history tells us that Pontius Pilate ultimately got recalled to Rome, and that one of 2 things likely happened. He was either executed or he committed suicide. And there's a lot of speculation about him because there's not a whole lot written after he returns to Rome. But it does make you kind of speculate a bit as to whether or not the situation with Christ was enough to just stir a man crazy. And of course, Rome's going to hear of the execution of Jesus. There's going to be outcries, and the church grows, and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot to maybe visit and study on this one. But the point I'm trying to make here is this, is that your decisions you have to live with. And if this was a decision that Pilate ultimately found himself not being able to live with, speaks a great deal about what we are to do. So what are some of the applications to modern life that we learn from Pilate as we look at his perspective on Jesus and how he just kind of dealt with him? I think one of the first ones to say is, be very careful about peer pressure and allowing the pressure of a moment to overwhelm you and overtake your better judgment, your good conscience, your convictions, your beliefs, because sometimes it is, in fact, tempting to go for the path of least resistance, they say, is always crooked. Going in a straight line is not quite as easy. If you think about a river, it's going to follow the path of least resistance. And a lot of times when we think about consequences to our decisions, we do just that. We think about how do we handle the consequences versus can I actually live with this decision? Resist the temptation also to conform to societal norms. You know, for Pilate, he had the mob and the crowd and the riot was brewing, and there was a great temptation there to just go with the flow for them, to appease them and to, kind of quell the moment. So resist the temptation then to conform to societal norms. There's also the important point here that making ethical decisions, even when it's difficult, going back again to making decisions that you can live with, we have to face the truth honestly. As Pilate was there with Jesus, having this banter back and forth of, well, what is truth? And sometimes we don't want to hear the truth. Sometimes the truth is very, very hard to hear. But it's worth contemplating, and it's worth facing honestly. And the final thing, and I think we see it with the end of Pilate's life, is living a life of integrity before living a life solely based on potential consequences. I think Pilate demonstrates for us that in the end, it's very likely that he just could not live with himself. We saw that with Judas last week, that in the end, his grief and his remorse was something so strong that it led him to take his own life. And perhaps, we don't know for certain, but perhaps for Pilate, it was the same thing, that in the end, this may have had such a culminating effect on him that he took his own life too. And so here we are. We're wrestling with that war within. And so I would just challenge you and encourage you to dig deep into the scriptures, to fortify your faith and your knowledge of God's word and his truth. Take up the sword of truth, right? And live your life by it each and every day. You won't be sorry. God bless you and take care.